welcome very, very much to Conversations. A pleasure to welcome to the program, and this is sincerely and deeply felt, a dear friend of mine and the universe, and that's Dr. Sidney Greenfield. He's a professor of anthropology. He's a emeritus at this time from University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. He's written voluminously on a great number of subjects with great authority, and he's got a great sense of concern for the human condition, and very thoughtful and a concerned citizen. Sidney, so good to welcome you to Conversations again.
Thank you, Harold. It's always a pleasure to be here and to continue our ongoing discussions.
Yeah. You do light up the room. Yes,
Thank
indeed.
you very much.
Now we want to talk today, and we talked a little bit before coming into the program about you've spent a lot of time. Maybe you can go over in a broad brush way your career or your academic background. But you've taken a lot of attention to Brazil. You spent a great deal of time there. We want to talk about it in terms of the current situation. Maybe just a quick rundown on your background, and then let's talk about Brazil.
Yeah, very briefly, I've been doing research in Brazil for more than half a century now on a lot of different subjects, and I've been following what's happening in Brazil. And recently, one of the interesting and important things that there have been a series of protests that started about 6 weeks ago when people came out into the streets at the beginning protesting against an increase in bus fares.
Yeah.
This was a few cent increase, but it comes along with the fact that buses are privatized in Brazil.
Okay.
And most people in the big cities have to travel long distances on crowded buses if they have work to get to work.
Okay.
And the increase of even a few centavos is really hurts them.
Right.
So these protests started, and they led day after day in terms of responses that people came out protesting bus fares and then began to protest politics. And what was happening is at this time there was an international soccer tournament that was taking place in various cities throughout the country. And the Brazilians love soccer.
Pele
They're
comes to
crazy
mind.
about soccer.
Yeah.
But
And
what
the
they
samba.
did was turn the protests against the football games, the soccer games, complaining that here is the government spending all of this money to bring in international tournaments, and next year it's going to be the World Cup, and the year after that it's going to be the Olympic Games. The government's putting up all of this money, and people are saying, you're not building hospitals, you're not building schools, you're not helping the people. And the protests focused on the government, and they tried to shut down the federal government in Brasilia, the state governments throughout the country. And these protests then moved on to complain about political corruption because there are a large number of scandals in which politicians, amongst others, have been indicted, but nobody's been put in jail.
Sounds a familiar pattern.
So it's a familiar pattern. Now this is happening, and I think it's important to point out that Brazil, following the Great Recession of 2008, was doing very well, according to the economists.
Lula and
they were doing very well, and the economy was growing. Unemployment was being reduced. They had established these cash transfers to help the poor. Poverty was being reduced statistically. Inequality was being reduced, and so forth. And here's Brazil amongst the many parts of the world where these protests are occurring.
Yes,
And this fits into the pattern of what's happening in Turkey, what's happening in Egypt, what's happening all over in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, in Chile, throughout the Americas. And this is something that's happening that we're not putting together.
Yeah, and it got to be, Sorrell used to write about it got to be huge dimensions in Brazil as in elsewhere, almost onto like a kind of general strike. That
Right.
was almost
Well,
a general
the,
strike. Yeah?
The unions
Uh-huh.
tried to declare general strikes. The truck drivers went out, blocked traffic. And what is interesting, they have a Workers' Party government that was involved, and I'll get back to this, in the overthrow of the dictatorship and the creating of the contemporary democracy, that tried to talk to the protests, and there was nothing specific
Yeah.
that the demonstrators could come up with, and the government tried to suggest things that got caught up in a big discussion itself and really went no place.
Right.
So what's happening is that the present government of Dilma Rostov was one of the most popular elected governments in the world, and all of a sudden that's becoming shaky, like what's happening elsewhere.
Why, and what are the implications of that in Brazil or in the Americas and also in the world, as you say, because you're saying similar things are happening throughout the world, and even echoes of our Occupy movement here in the United States, which might be coming on again. Yeah.
Was a protest without a focus.
Right.
And what it comes down to is that there
because it was so
seemed to
general.
be-
It was
there
a
seemed to be
general.
a general reaction of people complaining and saying things just aren't right, but they can't specify what is wrong.
What one step could be taken.
And essentially, the major criticisms are economic, but the focus of the protests are political. And so you have a disconnect that somehow there is a belief that governments can fix what's wrong with the economy in spite of the fact, as I'll point out in a minute, that since the development of neoliberal economics and market forces, government is being pushed back in many parts of the world, but somehow people expect somebody to come in and do something because essentially they're frustrated.
When would you date that neoliberal trend? And then you have also the things with Mr. Bush and so forth, you have a neoconservative input as well.
Okay.
So when would you date that from?
The whole thrust.
Because this is a worldwide thing you're beginning to hint at, that Brazil's
and
indicative
the
of.
whole worldwide thing comes post-1980 with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan as the major political forces. But this goes back even before that, because I really believe that what is happening today with these protests is that people are feeling dissatisfied. They're feeling that they have not gotten the promised rewards of modernization, development, and modernity. That is, they were sold an image of what would happen if they transferred their society into a modern industrial economy with a modern political system, and life was supposed to get better.
Well, now, if you're dating that from 1980.
No, that goes back to 1950, 1960. That goes back to after World War II, when the whole world, and particularly the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, Bretton Woods, and the government of the United States and the victors decided the end of colonialism. They were going to help modernize and develop the peoples of the world. And they set out to do this with the focus on economic development. And this is exactly the time that the Cold War begins. And the competition in the Cold War was one between the Soviets saying, we could do the same thing better, and the West saying, no, we can do it better. And the model that was offered out of the West turned out to be the United States in the 1950s and 60s, when something unique was happening.
Oh, yeah.
What was unique that was happening
in the United States.
In the United States, ordinary working people were able to earn enough money as salaries to buy homes, to buy cars, to buy television sets, to buy electronics, to buy refrigerators. And people all over the world looked at this and said, if
Wow.
this is if this is what modernization and development means,
We want that.
We want to buy into that.
Who wouldn't?
Who
right?
wouldn't?
Yeah, there
well,
was a
okay.
yeah.
Some maybe wouldn't, but I don't want
Yeah, I
to go
know.
there.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Essentially, people in Brazil bought into this, but something else was happening. And again, I'll use Brazil as the example because I know it best.
Yeah.
But parallel things were happening in other parts of the world. In Brazil, just look at it demographically.
Okay.
In 1940, before all of this begins, during World War II, there were like 41 million people in Brazil. And only a quarter of them lived in cities.
Okay, urbanization.
Okay? In the 1950s, you begin this industrialization and urbanization. The industries
And
are
this
there,
is
and
all-
they're import substitution
Yeah.
industries like automobiles and refrigerators
Right.
and all of the things that Brazil was importing.
Yeah.
And they built industries and they couldn't get private capital to do it. So the government stepped in with the development banks and bankrolled a good part of it, and the government owned a majority share of all of these interests.
You're talking Brazil.
In Brazil.
That was one example,
along
yeah.
with private interests. Okay. Then what happened is people moved from the rural areas into the cities.
Well, they
And-
okay.
Okay,
yeah.
and for the rest of the 20th century, the population of Brazil grew so that by the end of the 20th century, there were 180 million Brazilians.
Right.
There are like 200 million today, but that population increase was primarily in the urban areas. They were in cities, and the cities did not prepare
Was that
for
comparable
people.
to was that observable trend in the world?
Worldwide.
I think the worldwide has become
Worldwide this is
urbanized, yeah.
happening, and I'm giving
Yeah,
you the
yeah,
example of
right.
Brazil only because I
You-
know
you
it
so
best
know it so well, yeah, right.
to point this
Right,
out.
okay.
And by the end of the century, there were 100 million more people in Brazil than there had been in 1940.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
But the cities did not prepare for this massive migration and increase in the population. So what you had was a large number of people who squatted and built
Favelas.
favelas
Yeah.
on hillsides,
Yeah.
on swamps, where nobody can get involved in taking the land away from them.
Was that there might have been in the rural areas the possibility, like in the United States, you had the family farmers and things, ways of which to sustain oneself out in the boondocks, as they say.
They were mostly sharecroppers
Yeah.
and not
You're
because the
talking
land
Brazil
was
now.
owned. Brazil
Yeah.
was owned, so people were mostly sharecroppers, but in the rural areas, they were at least able to raise enough food and to hunt and fish to be able to eat. You move into the cities, if you don't earn money, you don't eat.
Right,
So
right.
poverty was rampant, and what happened was, in order to survive, what we call the parallel economy, the informal economy, as
Yeah.
economists call it,
Yeah.
developed, in which people did everything but resell packages of chewing gum on the streets, resell anything they could steal or get, and resell it to make money.
Yeah.
Records, pirated discs,
Yeah.
CDs when they came in. Today you can get movies
Yeah.
that are pirated.
And again, you're
Sold-
talking about Brazil, but you
Brazil,
want to put this within a world
but
context.
this is
yeah.
in a world
Yeah,
context.
right.
This
Okay,
is
yeah.
happening because a lot of these protests include poor people. Now Brazil then went through as this population increase and industrialization and urbanization is occurring, Brazil gets caught up in the Cold War. Like most of the Americas in the world get caught up in the Cold War, and the fear of communism, driven primarily by the United States, builds the potential for revolutions to take place, revolutions of the right. And dictatorships are put in place in Brazil and many other parts of the world that the United States
Greece,
supports against communism.
Yeah, well, that was another big geopolitical
So Brazil
take,
goes through a period of military dictatorship roughly from 1964, when they closed down the Congress, to 1985, when they re-democratized. The re-democratizing movements are framed in terms of the liberty and democracy and equality that goes back a long time
to the Enlightenment.
And the United States become the champion of this, because the other side of anti-communism was freedom and democracy. The Soviet Union was a dictatorship, and this trumped the argument over the economy. And this is what people came to expect, that when they re-democratized and got an elected government, everything else was expected to follow from it.
And following the American model.
Following the American model.
Ozzie and Harriet.
Now in Brazil, something else happens. And that is the rise of the Workers' Party and Luiz Ignacio Lula da Silva.
Yeah, right. When did he come in first?
In the 1980s.
It was the 80s,
And
Lula.
he is an auto worker, a union leader. And what has to be added for Brazil is that the early 20th century debates over labor and the role of labor in the economy, and labor versus capital, and mobilizing people through the unions and the union movement, that in the United States, out of partially the fear of the Soviet Union and communism, leads to opening up the possibility of unions and unionization, which leads to the increase in wages that most people benefit from, that really created that Ozzie and Harriet, as you talk about it, vision of America. Well, in Brazil, this labor movement takes over politically in the United States, but neoliberal economics are already in place. And Washington, the Washington Consensus, says to Brazil, like they said to many other peoples throughout the world, is you're gonna change your economy and make it private, and the markets are gonna run it, and you are going to privatize all of these companies that are owned partially by the government.
Okay, those are big trends you're talking about.
I'm talking about big trends going on that lead to privatization. And what happens along with this coming out of the United States is the pushback of capital and owners and corporations against labor, so that we've seen in the United States and Western Europe and in much of the world that the wages of workers have remained stable or gone down for the last 30 or 40 years,
30 or 40,
while entrepreneurs and capital are making money, the famous 1 or 2%, are making millions and hundreds of millions and billions. That is all the increase in wealth is going to them. Okay. So
that's a broad brush stroke.
This is a broad brush stroke, but this is the contradiction. So what we're doing is seeing today the masses of people, and particularly if you look at Brazil, you look around the world in terms of the leadership, what is happening is the people who went to school and got educated and graduated from college and are finding today they don't have jobs.
Well, okay,
they don't have jobs. Working people, and again, Brazil becomes one of the examples that unemployment declined significantly in Brazil. But these were low-wage jobs that paid minimum wages, and you can't buy houses and cars and electronics and all of the things in the image with minimum wage salaries. even the redistribution of wealth that took people out of poverty left them in a situation that through advertising, the extension of Madison Avenue worldwide, people cannot buy all of the things they believe that they were promised.
Okay, and now going back to the promise again, to the, when did that appear in the human order? And we did throw out a word, the Enlightenment.
Right.
Which comes out of 1776
Okay.
Europe in that.
The basic
how do we-
institutions that we're dealing with came out of the Enlightenment. And this was really a major transformation that occurred in Great Britain, where you privatized the commons. And this took several centuries, but it was intellectually put together in the Glorious Revolution under the leadership of people intellectually like John Locke, who in effect established the idea of private property and the market, and free self-regulating markets in which people had to work in order to earn money, because when you enclosed the commons, you pushed people off the land into the towns and cities.
When we talk about the Enlightenment, we're talking about, if I may, we're talking about that period. It's very often sort of marked as 1776. The steam engine was invented, heralding an industrial revolution, and it was signaling the end of about, I would say, 1,000 years of following the fall of the Roman Empire, which had gone for about 1,000 years, where the political legitimacy was assumed to be held in dynastic royal families with all of the Burke's peerage and so forth. And that had held for about 1,000 years in terms of the basic premises by which political legitimacy was to be established. And then the Enlightenment was more or less associated with coming into the modern world, industrial world, and like natural law, John Locke, and that sort of thing, which we were heirs to in the United States and used to build a new model that has been one you've been talking about in terms of coming up to the modern period. Am I more or less right?
But a couple of more pieces that
please,
I want to make explicit. And that is the Glorious Revolution in Great Britain,
88?
1688, really put in place the contemporary rulers of England. But at the time, they really put controls over the monarchy and Parliament, the elected representatives, not of all the people, but the elected representatives gained greater control.
And that goes back to Magna Carta.
Right. But what happened then is that the Parliament put in place the laws governing the market and private property.
Okay, Adam Smith,
setting
1776.
But this is more important. Setting up the police forces and the judicial system to enforce private property and the laws of the market. And government that came more and more to represent the interests of the people took as basic the rules of private property and markets and enforcing them in courts of law. Now this became the basis of the economy.
Common law.
And then the French Enlightenment and the later English Enlightenment opened the door to representative government.
I think it would begin with the Scottish Enlightenment more than the British.
The Scottish Enlightenment was more economic. Adam Smith comes out of that, and Adam Smith essentially lays out the rules of the modern economy that economists keep going back to because
like
this is taken as an almost divine law like gravity and the atmosphere that you can't change, you can modify it.
And it's built, the modern world is built more or less on that infrastructure of what was built up governmentally and in terms of the economy, and one that is coming to a period perhaps of existentially significant qualitative transformation as we relate to the future, rather than just reified
again, you're jumping
institutions out
ahead.
of the past.
You're
yeah.
jumping
Well, that's coming
ahead.
up to Brazil in the modern 20th century and so forth.
No, because what happens
Yeah.
is that this new system, this
Yeah.
new world economic and political
Now you're
system,
talking back the Enlightenment.
right,
Now we're talking
takes place in Europe, in
Yeah.
Western Europe,
Yeah.
and then it goes to the United States,
Yeah, right.
where people who are products of these institutions
Yeah.
bring them to the United States.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it is in the 19th century
Yeah.
that Great Britain, through its empire, carries this around the world, starting
That's right.
in
East India country,
the
yeah,
West
yeah.
Indies,
Company.
and so on,
Yeah.
and destroys literally traditional economies. They all become like the commons in England to be privatized.
Yeah. Oh,
and this
okay, that's
begins
interesting, yeah.
modern agriculture, where agricultural agricultural produce becomes commodities in the market
Yeah.
and no longer
World
food
market,
for
a
people.
world market.
A world
Yeah,
market,
yeah.
but no longer food for people. Commodities to be sold in the market
Right.
to whoever can pay the most.
Right.
And these growing cities where people are earning money, especially after the Industrial Revolution, are buying these commodities, and little by little, the rest of the world becomes the provider of agricultural commodities for people living in cities.
Yeah, and then that power of the British ruled the waves. I mean, the British ruled the waves, and then Admiral McMahon and the general thinking of what is called geopolitics, or it comes to be called geopolitik in the German interpretation of the word, became recognized, and I think it would probably go back through a lot of history, that the basis of political power was the ability to have military advantage over others that you can assert, and the source of the power was in your military ability to either conquer or co-opt other people with essentially your military power. And then that set up the whole thing of the heartland and the geopolitical structure. It happened to become that part of the Eurasian landmass invulnerable to sea power. Britain was a sea power. They could rule the waves, ruled that way, and that's what set up what was to become the conflict or the dialectic between the the heartland, so it happened to be Soviet Union, and the whole thinking that was manifest in terms of the United States in George Kennan, and the containment theory of containing this communist amoeba creeping out from the Eurasian landmass.
You're jumping on
that.
me.
Well,
Let me
that's
go
getting
back.
over into the political, the geopolitical context that brought in the United States emerging as the world power after the Second World War. That transformation.
I want to make a couple of
It was
links
based on
here.
military power and dominance, which remains to this current day.
Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations.
Right, right.
And the assumption, again coming out of the Enlightenment, that the world was organized in nations. Nations were arbitrary boundaries.
Well, it had been dynastic states to which
Well, they
loyalty
had been
for 1,000 years
dynastic
in Europe and other
states
parts
in Europe,
of the world.
and in other parts of the world,
Yeah.
there were all
So
kinds of different ways of organization.
Right.
States.
The nation state.
Nation state became the unit of organization.
Right.
Great Britain became a colonial power.
Oh, yeah.
But again, when I said after World War II, when Britain decolonialized, when Holland decolonialized, these became new nations. We organized the world in terms of nations that were arbitrary units that had no real foundation. Lots of different people with different cultures live in terms of nation states, but the rule of the nation state is if you have one nation, one government, whoever becomes the government dominates everybody else, and the police and the military are used to transform, enforce them, and also the foundation for this is the market, private property. Well, what happened between the 19th and mid-20th century is where England and the United States went, this is what we enforced. After 1950s, 1960s, with the independence movement, we've developed
decolonization,
everybody on the planet is part of a nation state. A nation state that has a government that dominates over the people who live in the territories. And what you were developing is the idea that within each nation state, and remember the economy, and Adam Smith and economists talk about the wealth of the nation.
Right.
The gross national product
Right.
is the product of the nation.
Yeah.
They don't talk about how this wealth is distributed.
Mm-hmm.
The axis for the distribution of wealth became capital and labor since the time of Adam Smith and before, going back to Locke. Okay, what happens gradually, as we know, capital got more and more of the wealth after industrialization. Labor got a smaller portion.
And that trend has come right up to the present.
Until the big break that occurred in the early 20th century in the United States, when labor got its foot in the political door and convinced the public that the greater good meant most of the people who were workers and not owners of capital, and as a result, capital was forced to bargain with labor, and wages went up, and this created the mythical period in the United States that became the model
for the world.
For the world.
Right, yeah, I think
so
you're right.
People again are coming back and saying, we expect this, even though, as you're saying, the battle between nations and government represented the wealth of the country, which was dominated by capital.
Well, that was
and
the trend.
The interests of capital in the geopolitics of the world.
Right. Well, that was also...
No, and what this did was create this contradiction between what labor and working people were able to do as opposed to capital in controlling the government.
And also the means of production was shifting from, they were very, in Tom Jefferson's day, it was probably 10% of the input was anything other than labor. You'd take 12 hours to make a pair of boots, handmade, no manufacturing, no massive anything. And those things over the course of the time since then have probably reversed, that it's actually capital instruments other than labor that is responsible for production, and we're still having a liberal movement or a liberal way of thinking that wants to sing the praises of labor, which Lane Kirkland and Walter Reuther and so forth were able to build up to where they had great power and great influence in the United States as a model, and that we ought to get good wages or good jobs for everybody as a way of distributing demand, as they had been relevant, but that's becoming out of date when the actual means in which the production is going on is with robots and so forth, that it's more and more, and the capital instruments are all owned by a tiny plutocratic class.
You're two steps ahead of me again, reaching conclusions that I want to build in this background, so give me a moment.
Well, okay, but we want to get to some solutions that might, some explanation of why there is so loose, in a general sense, angst in the world. It takes the form of things in Brazil and Egypt and other places, including the United States. And despite the fact that this Occupy movement that was a stirring among the people in the United States, something's wrong in a fundamental way was manifest, and it was beaten down by Mr. Bloomberg and his 33,000-man army against it, and taken that. And now they're trying to say everything's fine, just get a job, keep your nose to the grindstone, it's your fault, get a job, get a middle-class life, and so forth, and it's not working, and it's being sensed as not being working or workable, and that we want to address.
Okay. Since the Industrial Revolution, all of the wonderful things that we've been able to invent and produce, again, have been primarily for urban markets.
Okay,
the
well, that was the trend.
Raw materials of the earth are being transformed.
With the urban and suburban.
And we have been very clever in building machines.
Yeah.
Now, these machines for a period of time, and I'm going back to the post-World War II era,
Yeah.
where we needed labor to run the machines.
Well, there was a time.
And
yeah.
there was, yeah, hold it. But what I'm saying is the dream, the vision that we sold to the people of the world was based upon a period when we needed labor
Right.
to run the machine.
Detroit just went
Detroit
bankrupt.
is the
Yeah,
classic
yeah,
example.
Yeah, Mr. Ford, $5
What
a
has
day. yeah.
happened
Yeah.
since, particularly in the 21st century, is we have been able to build machines. You talked about robotics.
Robotics
we have been
particularly
able
are
to
moving.
build
Yeah.
machines
Uh-huh.
that have transformed the manufacturing process.
Manufacturing and also
we need less and less in the way of labor.
it also impacts and will impact services that
Hold
were
it.
taken over after manufacturing in the minds of many people, so that you can keep distributing land income
need-
by jobs.
We need
It's not gonna
less
work.
and less labor. However,
Across the board.
hold it a minute.
Okay.
We need less and less labor, but the world economy
Is all structured on labor.
is all no.
Yeah, okay.
That's the
It's
point.
not,
The
okay.
world economy is able to produce more and more
Without
with
people.
more machines, with fewer and fewer people.
Lord Keynes warned
so
about it.
what
warned
we
about
are
it.
doing is using the labor that is cheapest in
Yeah.
China and Asia and
Well,
elsewhere,
it took a whole
breaking unions.
Yeah.
And remember what I said before
Pepco was
about the
broken.
growth of cities. We now have, like Brazil, population escalating, as I said, from 40 million to 200 million today.
Yeah, oh.
Worldwide population is up to over 7 billion,
Yeah.
and most of this now is in cities
yeah.
where people are living and need access to wages, to some form of income in
Yeah.
order to survive, and there aren't jobs.
Okay, and the
We
trend.
cannot create jobs for all of these people. However, we still speak and run our society as if we lived in terms of a world where there were going to be more than enough jobs
Yeah.
for everybody.
That was the example in America.
Like, and
after
this
the-
is what we promised people.
Yeah.
And it's not happening, and we have no way to distribute income to these people for whom there are no jobs.
And
this is part of the angst.
Yeah, right. And the liberal wing of things, let's say what they call progressives or things like that, are very tied into the labor theory of value. Marxists are. And then even beyond that, they say labor, capital is nothing but congealed labor, and they got all this argument. And then the general society is tied into the idea that you get your identity through a job,
Right,
and that's
exactly.
and this idea, and that's all we hear from the president. That's
What
all we hear from the
Obama's
people.
stimulus package is to create jobs.
Jobs. That's the only way to distribute demand.
The question
Or
becomes how you create jobs
Okay.
when the market does not need more people.
Oh, wait a minute.
What has happened? Well, just a
Why don't we
second here.
just
Just
say,
a
why don't,
second
well,
here.
I want to take some. Why don't you say, we don't need people anymore? Should we just go to that and say, we don't need people? People have no purpose other than producing.
No. We need some people.
No, but that's a
Wait a second,
that's what
Harold.
people will
What
happen
we
in
need,
people's identity.
What we need is high-power engineers. Now, let me go back
Well,
to
that's
what
a
you're
job.
saying
That
about
can be a
people.
job.
We have created a culture in which people's identity, as you say, is wrapped up in their work.
Yeah, right.
Their very egos, their very persona.
their
what
income
we're seeing,
their-
what we're
their-
seeing today, Harold.
Not their work.
What
Not
we're
their work,
seeing
if I may.
today
Work is like
that
art or something worthwhile,
No,
not standing there
hold it,
doing
hold
some
it.
military-like
No,
function to produce more
no.
value.
people's identity
Yeah.
are tied up in their work. Men are still believe that their very being is based on their ability to earn income and support
Wait a minute. Now
families.
you've
Women are
bastardized the language, if you may, by
haven't
saying by
bastardized it.
equating work with a job. A job is like a slave function. in order to...
This isn't your definition.
Yeah. Now
no,
but
permit
look,
me.
try to make your way as a poet. Try to make your way as a composer. Try to make your way in any of the goods
It's
of
not
civilization.
accepted as a job in our culture.
Well,
that's
that's not the fault of the people.
Permit me.
Work is an
Permit me,
honorable
Harold.
term. Work is when somebody's doing something inner-directed that they want to do, and they can do it well, and it's given such total short shrift. The only thing that
Harold.
matters is how it fits into creating value for the economic model, and that's the problem. They should be free to take care of children. They should be free to make the things that are really worthwhile, and worthwhile in terms of the human identity by which the goods of civilization rather than the goods of production.
Let me say I agree with you fully, but I started this saying I wanted to talk about ethnography and history.
Okay, good, okay.
And what I'm talking about is in reality, people's identities are based upon their jobs through which they earn income.
They should not
this
be.
Is, excuse me.
Okay.
This is what we have sold in the image of modernization, development, and modernity around the world. People in Greece, people in Chile, people in Brazil, people in China are learning
and in the United
because
States,
they are living in a culture that is defining one's place in the world in terms of a job. And they believe this. So what we are finding with unemployment in the United States, as big a problem as not having an income is what it does to your ego as an individual. We're creating therapy sessions to help people. All of this is there, and what I want to say to you is that what is happening is we no longer need the number of people who have been put on the planet in cities who need a source of income. And this is the key to the frustration. And most important, neither our political leaders, our economists, or most of our intellectuals can put together the situation. So what we're seeing played out in the streets of people in Brazil, in Chile, is the angst that's coming out. And when the politicians, like the good politicians in Brazil, who are out of the Workers' Party, are saying, let's sit down and talk and see what we can do, nobody can put it together to say we're living in terms of institutions
that are out of date,
cannot provide
for the future.
How do we come along? Who is going to come up with a new vision of the world? And most important, that we haven't talked about, remember, that out of the Marxist thinking that came out of the same tradition as Adam Smith and capitalism, the belief was if you have a revolution and let the workers run things, everybody will be a worker and things will be better. We don't need all of those workers, but in the streets,
we needed them then.
In the streets, we still hear the voices of opposition are articulated to a leftist Marxist vision.
Practically all.
And what they're doing is arguing with neoliberal and neoconservative politicians in terms of something that was based on the last century, the reality of the last century.
We only got a few minutes left and everything, and where do we go, and how are we going to, if we cannot distribute demand or buying power, they're going to need to have buying power distributed to the masses in order to clear the market of things that can now be produced by robotics and so forth, but they have to get demand into the hands of the people. If you're not going to do it by getting a job or inventing a job or making work or something to give a job, to give money to somebody, how are we going to get money to the masses of the people in order to be able to buy the things that give them the advances of a good way of living that is now available to us? Also, don't forget the ecology and the externalities and so on. How are we going to get that to them so that then they can get on with the things that really matter, like living well, living with the culture, doing cultural things, rather than just these robot kind of functions that are being taken over by robots?
What you have just done is make the same assumptions everybody does, that the rules of the market and distributing wealth are sacrosanct and unchangeable.
Well, getting buying power into the
excuse
hands
me.
of the masses of the people.
That's if you accept this. What
Well,
I want to suggest,
okay.
what I want to suggest is the possibility of going back to the drawing board
Okay.
and saying, let's
Well, I
start
thought I was.
No, you weren't.
okay.
Let's start rethinking
Uh-huh.
the Enlightenment and the Glorious Revolution and what came after it.
Okay.
There have been, and there might very well be, other ways of organizing production and distribution and organizing people other than those of the market and private property and the nation state.
Okay.
That's as a starter.
Like co-ops, like Madrigal
hold
or
it,
something?
hold
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
What I really want to get across is
Yeah.
the idea that if we go back to the Enlightenment, we can start rethinking and rethink it in terms of the perspective I'm coming from
Yeah.
is that of a cultural relativist who says there are other possibilities out
Okay.
there.
What are a couple?
All right.
We got a few
now,
minutes.
now, wait a second. Where you are,
Yeah.
if you lock into the market and distributing wealth through capital and labor and possible other ways, you and I know that people like Louis Kelso and Norman Kurland have provided ways of distributing wealth keeping the same system of production. And that is, as you very well know, Norman's idea of capital homesteading, and I hope you do a program
We're
with
going to. We're
Norman
going to do one by
that he
Skype,
can
yeah.
develop this fully. I'm really trying to set the foundation for what he's doing.
All right.
That
All
if
right.
you enable
Yeah, well, that's good.
everybody, not only
If you
workers,
do what,
if
everybody?
you enable everybody,
Enable everybody what?
everybody, not only workers, to be owners of companies and
Okay. Or sources of
earn
production,
own
yeah.
stock in the companies, even if they're financial companies. I mean, the major sources of wealth being earned in the world today are in finance, in marketing, and sales.
Yeah.
Well, these are
Finance,
owned by
right.
corporations, and if everybody could get an ownership in them, the dividends being distributed will go so that everybody will have a source of income.
Well,
It doesn't have to be a great source of income, but it will enable them to buy some of the necessities that if we get off the idea of selling the notion that you should have the right to everything, you can be anything and have everything,
Yeah, we might
which
have
is
to
no
get to
longer
that.
possible.
We might have to get to that, yeah.
We may have to reduce that and
Well,
say if
well,
we
I
could,
disagree with that, but go ahead.
well,
yeah.
I don't know whether even with the new level of technology, we can produce enough for everybody, all 7 billion of us, to have a yacht.
Well, I think we're going to have to do that.
Well, I
yeah,
don't think
yeah.
we can do that.
Well, I think
but if this is at all possible,
Mm-hmm.
I will certainly step back and say, let's go ahead. But I'm willing to start.
Mm.
And what I'm saying here, what I'm saying now is, I really hope that some of the people who are frustrated
Mm-hmm.
out there, that the system is not working, the institutions aren't working, can begin to start thinking that there are other ways to distribute wealth other than through work. And
Well,
that your
okay,
vision
good, that's
of
good.
how human beings should live becomes a possibility,
Mm.
so that a poet, if he has a guaranteed source of income, doesn't have to worry about finding someone to buy his poetry.
That's right.
An artist doesn't have to get someone to buy his paintings.
But nor do they have to suffer the pangs of unemployment and poverty,
That's
which has
right.
been the case for
that
all
we
the
can
people
have
practicing.
theater, that we
Yeah.
can have
Yeah,
cultural
yeah, right.
creativity.
Those are goods of civilization. yeah.
These are the good things we've
Yeah.
created.
But they have no value now.
Only if they serve the market.
Yeah, yeah. The only thing that upset me when you were coming, you did a thing that was really good, Norman and Kelso, and nesting them with some of the intellectual thinkers and that kind of thing. You said something about the capital, and for the vast majority of humanity, the only way they think of getting income, particularly the least advantaged people, when you go into the third developing world. The only way they think of getting anything is through having it's our president. And he's talking about middle class. And he's talking about that miracle of after the Second War and all that, is to have a job. That's what we have to do. That's what everything's about, is creating a job. Well, and the jobs are not
perpetuating
so
the myth.
how, if there is there possible to have demand distributed to the masses, like 100 trillion cells in a human organism, a model, every cell matters, every cell's in connection with everything, and they make a system that works.
Okay.
So we may be getting to a point where we're going to have to either liberate the humanity, which is something never has been possible out of all of history.
All right.
And I don't think it's too much to reach for that.
Yeah.
We have a possibility, ephemeralization, doing more with less. We have to take into account the ecology. We have to have that capability, and we are transcending material scarcity at an ontologic level.
Good.
That should not be given over.
How do we get from where we are now to there?
Well, I think you got to have an alternate way of distributing demand to the people, or buying power
what
to
I'm
the
looking
people,
for
money.
is a process. How do we get into the frustration in the streets?
No,
the frustration in the streets,
Right.
the understanding that the problem is distributing wealth through jobs. That the president of the United States, well, that's what I'm saying. That we need an alternative to
way
this,
to distribute
and
buying power
to get
the
things
people.
like the thinking of people like Kelso and Curlin and Ashford and those of us who are talking this way to be part of popular discourse.
Well, why not?
How do we get politicians to be willing to run for office and say, I understand that the institutions we have today are not serving your needs, and we have to change them, and here are some possibilities that if we can get control even of the politics that have to be changed, we can institutionalize ways of people owning shares in all of the major corporations that they will pay for out of earnings,
out of future
earnings,
rather than past
and will
savings.
be liberated from wage slavery.
Okay, very good.
And
now,
those who want to be engineers can be engineers and earn additional money. But the poets and the actors and all of the intellectual people, and even those who aren't very good at it, can do other things in life because we can continue producing. We have to just figure out this new way to distribute.
Well, we have a supply and demand problem, and that kind of thing that's really there. And the only
supply and demand problem is that we can't distribute it.
That's right. We have a capability, and then don't forget forgetting all that outsourcing, that containerizations came, all kinds of revolutions and things that made supply chains around the world and all the things. And remember, the system does work. I mean, airplanes run.
Hold it.
Things work.
Before you go on with that, there's another piece I haven't gotten to.
Okay, we've only got about 5 minutes
Very
left, so
quickly,
use haiku.
And that is the way we are producing things. We're destroying the planet.
Well, that's something
and somehow,
ecological.
this has to be added in the process.
Yes,
because
those are
some of the people out in the streets are screaming about our destruction of the planet.
Those are called externalities. They've never been figured in.
When we make everything into a commodity and say, if you could use it to earn money, you do it. No, we've got to get back from that.
Yeah, that has to be included in the ecology.
All right, in the new kind of thinking, that what I'm saying is we need, in the political arena, the people in the streets, the Occupy Wall Street people, the people in Brazil, the people in Greece, the people in Turkey, have to be able to sit down for a moment and say, what we're really doing is complaining that the institutions aren't working. Here are some ideas that we can come in and say, no, this is what we have to do. We have to make sure that everybody, all of us, workers or not, stop thinking in terms of jobs. Everybody has to become an owner in the companies that are earning the greatest wealth, and this is a way to help equalize the distribution of wealth and enable people to have the money to buy the commodities that increases the demand
and the
that
leisure to
stimulates
lead
the
the good
system,
life.
as long as we don't destroy the planet
Okay,
in the
that's
process.
good. No, we got a political problem in that because the people that are doing very well, there's a small group, 1% or so, they're not going to be doing it. Or let's say the Republican
But they
way
control
of seeing
the
things.
government that
They
still
do.
makes the laws within the
Yes,
national
okay,
boundaries
they do.
and
so
so on
what
down
you
the
want to
line.
talk, the hope for coming up for something like that might come from the intellectual systems thinkers and so forth, and they tend to be of a liberal persuasion more or less and everything, and they're all caught up in this thinking about how wonderful it is to get a job and an identity and so on. And the book that you're talking about, or the system way of thinking, it sounds a little counterintuitive or something, because what they're against is capitalism, where these people are getting so wealthy. And the book you're talking about that is the Bible for this thinking of economics that is there is called the Capitalist Manifesto. That's
Well,
not exactly a term that the left wants to hear because they think the capitalism is the enemy at the door and everything, but that's exactly
That's
what
Louis
they should
Kelso.
be putting forth.
That's Louis
Let me say,
Kelso
that's
and
what they
all of
should
his
be
disciples.
That's what they should be. There aren't that many.
But
There should be
no,
more.
but what they have
But
to
that's
do
what they're putting up because what you have
as
to
a final
do.
word.
No, well,
Final
all right,
word.
go on.
They
please.
have to articulate it so that the people in the streets who are out demonstrating begin to understand
Yeah.
it and be able to say, this is something new that we want. When the politicians sit down and say, we'll talk to you like they're doing in Brazil,
Yeah.
this is what you have to put to them
Okay.
so that you can begin the process.
And that's going to come out of the intellectual community and everything who would never want to deal with that. But if it was a term of William Shakespeare, who was one of those poets and whatnot, he said, hoist this, even if you're critical, you're not just going along, you're critical, you will hoist the whole system on its own petard by saying, yes, capitalism. And that you can, that's the way the progressive community should be going in terms of getting at the means by which they'll attract
But it
enough to
becomes
make the whole system
important
change.
to understand this Enlightenment background to
Yeah.
what capitalism has become and what it really is,
Well,
particularly this focus on jobs, labor, and capital.
Right,
We've got to
right.
get over that.
Yeah, but it's the liberals that are at fault. The intellectual liberals
I don't care
are at
who's
fault
at
for
fault.
not coming up.
It's not important
an
who is
answer.
at fault. What is important is that we get this into popular discussion.
Okay,
This
we just
program
did.
is one example
Yes.
of this. I congratulate you
Yeah, no,
for
I
doing things
congratulate
like
you for
that.
getting it all
and
in.
others, we have to continue this discussion in the universities, in the streets,
Yeah.
all over.
All right,
this
that's
is
right.
what's necessary.
And I just differ. I think it began when we came out of the when we emerged as a Homo sapiens species. We've been on a long process. Think about it evolutionarily, not just politically. Thanks
this
a
is
lot.
the way it's got to go in the streets.
Well, okay. Well,
That's
you gotta
the
have,
way we have to
and
work.
you got to get some sort of a critique that we have to have something the future allows now, liberating.
This is
rather,
what we do.
rather
And I
than
go back to you.
annihilating it.
My other title is through the Columbia University seminars, where we try to be think tanks
Yeah.
that do this, not the think tanks that the right has established.
And you do it in public.